There are places in the world that don't appear on any map, places that aren't marked by signs or coordinates, but live in the blurred memory of someone, somewhere, who swears they once saw something strange and unforgettable. Tonight, I want to take you to one of those places. You don't have to believe in it. You don't even have to remember it tomorrow. Just listen. Let it drift past you, like a dream that doesn't need to be real to mean something. This story is not about proof. It's not about truth. It's about an emptiness, a hole, one that should not be there, and maybe one that never was, except in the spaces between stories and sleep. So let's begin where the world seems to end. In the soft, wooded hills of Washington State, not far from the town of Ellensburg, a man named Mel Waters once claimed to have found something impossible. It was 1997 when Mel first called a radio station called Coast to Coast AM. It was a show that welcomed the unusual, ghost stories, conspiracies, and everything that floated just outside the borders of reality. He didn't sound wild or frantic. He sounded calm, ordinary, and perhaps that's what made his story so unforgettable. Mel said he owned some land in a rural area outside Ellensburg. He had lived there for years, and on that land there was a hole in the ground, perfectly circular, lined with ancient stone, and, according to Mel, endless. Not just deep, not just mysterious, but infinite. He said it had always been there, that even the local native tribes had whispered stories about it, that people had once thrown trash into it. Old tires, broken TVs, glass, things they no longer wanted. But no sound ever came back. No splash, no echo, just silence. And the things never came out again. Not even when you waited days or years. Mel said he decided to test how deep it really was. So he gathered fishing line, miles and miles of it. He attached a small weight to the end and slowly began lowering it into the hole. 1,000 feet, 2,000, 5,000, no bottom, 10,000 feet. Still no end, no tug, no tension. Just lines sliding into the darkness like thread into a bottomless well. By the time he reached 15 miles of line, he stopped, not because he'd reached anything, but because he had run out of fishing line. 15 miles? That's nearly 24 kilometers. A distance impossible for any known hole in the Earth's crust. And yet, Mel insisted, it wasn't just the depth that was strange. It was the feeling around it, the way animals refused to go near it, the way birds avoided flying above it, the way sound behaved near its edge, distorted, sometimes swallowed completely. Some said it made compasses spin. Others said electronic devices failed near it. A strange quiet surrounded it, not just an absence of noise, but a kind of negative space, as if the world itself bent inward, slightly, around that point. And the people who had known about it, they never talked much, maybe because they were afraid, or maybe because it's hard to explain something that doesn't feel like it belongs in this world. Mel had no photographs, no measurements anyone could verify. He wasn't selling anything. He didn't ask for money. He just wanted to talk, to tell someone, and somehow that made it feel more real. Because when someone tells you a story calmly, without trying to convince you, without raising their voice, you start to wonder, what if they're not lying? What if they truly believe it? And what if, just maybe, what they believe is real enough? The hole became known as Mel's Hole. Not officially, of course. No government agency ever investigated it. No signs point to it, and the exact location was never revealed. Mel said he had to be careful, that he'd already been warned. Not long after he made his story public, things started to go wrong. He claimed the government officials came to his land, that they blocked access, that they told him to leave. Later he disappeared, for a while, but that part comes later. Right now we're just at the edge, standing on the rim of a hole that may or may not exist, peering in, listening for something, a sound, an echo, a feeling, but hearing only silence. And what a strange silence it is. The kind that isn't empty, the kind that presses against your ears, like you've stepped into a room where time has stopped, or where something is waiting. Something old, something deep, something that has no name. And maybe that's why we remember it. Not because we believe in Mel, not because we need the story to be true, but because something in us recognizes that shape, the circle, the depth, the dark, because maybe every one of us carries a version of that hole, a part of us that feels bottomless, a place we throw our worries, our fears, our questions, a place we return to when we close our eyes at night, not to fall into it, but to listen to what it doesn't say. Mel's hole might be just a story, but stories like this, they echo, sometimes louder than truth. And maybe tonight, you've already begun to hear it, a quiet hum beneath your thoughts, a memory of something impossible, just waiting to be remembered. But don't worry, we're just getting started. There's more to this hole than silence, much more. That question floated through Mel's mind as he watched the fishing line sink, foot by foot, into the silent mouth of the hole. At first, it was a simple idea, a test, an experiment. Tie a small weight to the end of the line, drop it in, wait for it to touch the bottom. That's what anyone would do, standing at the edge of something strange. We measure what we don't understand. We weigh the unknown. We try to make it ours. Mel began with a single spool, then another, then another. Fishing line isn't heavy. It coils gently in the hand. But after a while, it starts to feel endless, especially when the earth gives nothing back. The first 1,000 feet were unremarkable. The line slid down without resistance. Then 2,000, then 5. Mel waited, watching, measuring by feel. No sudden stop, no bounce, no change. The soft hiss of the line sliding away, like thread into a needle held by invisible hands. By 10,000 feet he felt the edge of belief start to fray. Surely something would interrupt the descent. Surely the weight would land, or tug, or catch. But nothing came, and so he continued. He bought more line, spools stacked in boxes, tied end to end with careful knots, each knot a small hope. Maybe this will be the one that finds the bottom. 15,000 feet, 20, 30. He reinforced the pulley system, began measuring his line in miles, not feet. The weight kept going. At 40,000 feet, he began to laugh, not because it was funny, but because something inside him had surrendered. When the world stops making sense, sometimes the only thing left is wonder. Mel kept lowering the line until he reached 82,000 feet. That's nearly 25 kilometers. To compare, the deepest officially recorded hole ever drilled by humans is the Kola Super Deep Borehole in Russia, just over 12 kilometers. And even that took decades, with industrial machines and government funding. But here was Mel, standing alone in the woods, holding the end of a fishing line that vanished into silence. He said the line never went slack, never shifted, never felt like it had reached anything solid. At some point he just stopped. Not because he reached the bottom, but because the line was gone. He had no more to give, and the hole, quiet as ever, gave no answer. Now, was this even possible? Number a hole that deep, open to the air, would collapse under its own weight. The heat and pressure from the earth would distort its walls, fill it in, change it forever. The laws of geology are not kind to fantasy, but that didn't stop Mel from believing, and maybe that didn't stop others from listening, because the hole had already stopped being a place. It was becoming something else, an idea, a symbol, a shape that kept drawing people in, not down into the earth, but inward towards some invisible center of their own curiosity. Mel described the process in detail. He even said he tried using lasers, dropping flares sending sound down the shaft. Nothing worked. Lasers diffused strangely. Flares never came back. Sounds felt swallowed, like yelling into a dream. And when you think about it, doesn't that match how we experience the unknown? We send out questions like lines into the dark, and when we get no answer, we interpret the silence as depth, not proof, but possibility. Mel never claimed to be a scientist. He just wanted to know. He had grown up near that hole. He remembered hearing old stories, local legends, quiet warnings whispered over fences. Some people threw garbage in, others threw ashes, some even tossed in old hunting dogs, believing it was more natural than burial. The hole never complained. It never gave anything back. A place that only receives, never reflects, never resists, just accepts. And still, Mel insisted there was more. He once said he lowered a small radio down the line with a microphone attached. He wanted to listen, not just to silence, but to the hole itself. He claimed he heard strange things, tonal shifts, muffled vibrations, as if something deep below was humming. He said it reminded him of a song without melody, just low, soft rhythms, mechanical, but not quite, organic but too regular. But again, no recordings, no evidence, only his voice describing the moment with unsettling calm. And you have to ask yourself, if you stood at the edge of that place with miles of line disappearing into it, how would you feel? Would you believe the line just keeps going? Would you wonder what it's tied to, if anything? Would you wait for it to snap? Or would you turn away, pretending you'd never seen it at all? There's something deeply human about needing to measure the unknown. We throw out tape measures, ask for distances, for depths, for definitions. But some things won't be measured, won't be caught. Some things only open when you stop asking, and maybe that's what Mel found. Not a physical depth, but a silence that had no end. Not emptiness, but something vast that refuses to be named. That was the line he lowered, not just into the ground, but into the idea of the hole itself. And every time we remember this story, every time we picture that endless thread vanishing below us, we lower a line too, one that may never come back. And strangely, we don't seem to mind. Before we had words, we had instincts. Long before we built machines to measure the world, we watched animals, and we noticed things. We noticed that dogs bark at certain places, even when nothing is there. That cats pause, ears turning toward something silent. That Birds, those nervous, watchful creatures, sometimes change direction mid-flight, as if avoiding something only they can see. Mel's hole was one of those places. He said the animals didn't like it, didn't go near it, refused even. Birds wouldn't fly over it. Dogs would whimper when brought close. Wildlife, usually curious, walked wide around the site, as if repelled by something invisible. Mel didn't think much of it at first. He just noticed. It was like the hole had a scent that only animals could detect. Not smell exactly, but something else. A kind of presence. He once said that his dog, a shepherd mix named Red, would follow him anywhere, through rivers, fields, even through storms, but not to the edge of the hole. Every time they approached it, Red would stop, tail down, ears back, frozen, no growl, no bark, just refusal, and not the kind of fear that can be trained out of a dog. This was something older, something instinctive, a knowing that didn't need proof. Mel respected that. He stopped bringing Red close. After a while, he stopped going himself. Because if something can unsettle the ones who know only the now, the ones who live without imagination or superstition, then maybe it deserves a little distance. Animals don't need stories to feel afraid. They don't need to believe in monsters. They don't invent ghosts. They just listen to the world, its sounds, its textures, its changes, and respond. Humans, on the other hand, we complicate things. We feel a breeze and wonder what it means. We hear silence and fill it with memories. We see a shadow and give it a name. But animals, they just move. And Mel noticed that everything around the hole moved differently. Squirrels, usually bold and chattering, were quieter in the area. Deer passed through quickly, never stopping to graze. Even insects seemed fewer, as if the earth itself discouraged life too close to the edge. Some locals said their livestock acted strange, cows refusing to eat when tethered nearby, goats crying out for no reason, only to settle as soon as they were led away. None of it was dramatic, no sudden horror, no fleeing herds, just quiet refusal, a gentle insistence, not here. And that made Mel wonder, what was the hole giving off? Was it sound? Was it vibration? A scent beyond human perception? Something magnetic? Something wrong? He asked around. Some neighbors agreed, others dismissed it. But the old ones, they just nodded. They had stories too, not about monsters, or demons, or aliens, just warnings, old warnings, of places that don't want company, places where the earth is thin, where something breathes underneath. Too slow to notice, unless you're very, very still. And animals, of course, are always still in that way. They listen differently. They listen with their skin. Mel became obsessed with this idea that maybe we, too, once knew how to hear like that, before language, before logic, before we needed to explain everything. He started reading about animal senses, how birds can sense the Earth's magnetic fields, how elephants detect distant storms through their feet, how bees dance messages in the dark. There's a language under our language, a deeper one, and the whole, perhaps, was speaking in it, not to us, but to everything else, and it said, stay away. Of course, we didn't listen. We never do. But part of Mel believed that the whole wasn't meant for us, that it was old, older than memory, that it had been left alone for so long because every other creature understood something we'd forgotten. He once sat at the edge for an hour, not moving. No measuring, no line, just silence. And in that silence he heard something. Not a sound, not a voice, but a feeling. The same feeling he saw in Red's eyes whenever they got too close. A calm, steady knowing this is not for you. And maybe he thought that was okay. Maybe the whole didn't need to be understood. Maybe it wasn't a mystery to solve, but a message to receive. A boundary, a quiet one, marked not by fences, but by instinct. Animals cross rivers, they climb mountains, they walk into fire, but they don't cross this. And when Mel stopped trying to understand the whole, when he stopped measuring and asking and fearing, he found something else, a kind of peace. Not the peace of comfort, but the peace of recognition that not everything is for us, that some places are allowed to remain unknowable, and that maybe in listening without needing to explain, we become just a little more like them, a little more like the birds that veer quietly away, a little more like the dog who stands still at the edge, a little more ready to listen, even in the dark, even when we don't understand, especially then. We've heard the story, we've looked into the hole, we've watched the animals hesitate at its edge, but who was the man who brought us here? Who was Mel Waters? If this were a conventional mystery, we'd start with dates, birth certificates, photographs, a timeline. But Mel Waters left behind very little. No verified address, no academic background, no official record confirming his name, only his voice and his story. He didn't step forward in front of cameras. He didn't publish a book. He didn't even show his face. All we have is a man on the radio calling in to a show that specialized in the unexplained, speaking softly about something he couldn't understand. That, in itself, is strange. In an age where even the faintest rumor becomes content, Mel was an anomaly. He wasn't trying to sell anything. He didn't demand attention. He never asked to be believed. He just spoke, and people listened. The first call came on February 21st, 1997, to Coast AM, a late-night radio program hosted by Art Bell. Art was already a legend in his own right, a voice that guided millions through alien sightings, conspiracy theories, time travel claims, and all the spaces where reality frayed at the edges. That night, Mel introduced himself plainly. "My name is Mel Waters," he said. "I live near Monastash Ridge, and I have a hole on my property that seems very deep." No drama, no theatrics, just a steady voice, nervous but calm, describing something no one else could verify. He spoke for hours, telling how the hole had always been there, how the community had quietly accepted its presence, how, over the years, he became more and more curious, until one day, curiosity turned into obsession. And the way he told it, it didn't feel like a performance. He didn't rush, he didn't embellish. In fact, he often paused, as if double-checking his own memory before continuing. Listeners noticed something strange. He didn't sound like someone lying. He sounded like someone remembering. There's a difference. He wasn't defensive. He didn't push. He answered questions, but didn't try to impress. And that made it worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. Because when someone speaks plainly about the impossible, your mind doesn't reject it outright. It hesitates. It wonders. What if they're not delusional? What if they really saw what they say they saw? And what if they're not the only one? Over the next few years, Mel would call the show again, always with updates, new details, new reflections, but never with proof. No recordings, No photos, no physical evidence of the hole, not even a location. He said he couldn't give that away, that it would be dangerous, that he was being watched. He claimed, eventually, that government agents visited his land, that they sealed off the area, that they forced him to leave the country, even hinting that he'd been taken to Australia for a time, against his will. These were the only parts of his story that began to fray. The more the calls continued, the stranger the events became. From shadowy agencies to blacked out helicopters to interference on his phone. Still, his tone remained the same. Mel never raised his voice, never used fear, never told listeners to panic. Instead, he seemed almost tired, as if the weight of knowing something no one else could see had become too much. And maybe that's why people kept listening, because we've all known someone like Mel, someone who doesn't quite fit, who carries a secret not out of pride, but burden, someone who walks between belief and doubt, not trying to convert anyone, just trying to be heard. Mel once said he didn't want attention. He only called because he thought people deserved to know. Because if there was something in the ground that could swallow a line for miles, maybe it shouldn't be forgotten. He wasn't eloquent, but he was clear. He wasn't persuasive, but he was steady. And sometimes steadiness is more powerful than proof, because what Mel gave us wasn't a hole in the ground. It was a mirror, not to look into, but to feel reflected by. A mirror for the part of us that wants to believe something impossible might still exist, that not everything has been mapped, that not all stories are over. Mel became a kind of folk figure, not a hero, not a villain, something quieter, a custodian of the unexplained. He never asked for that role. He just stepped into it. And then, just as quietly as he arrived, he faded away. No one knows where Mel Waters went. There were rumors that he died, that he changed his name, that he moved to another state or country, that he was silenced. But the truth is simpler. He disappeared into the story. He became part of the whole, swallowed by it, not in body but in myth. And maybe that's the most fitting ending he could have had, because Mel never wanted to be the center. He wanted the whole to be the center. He wanted us to listen to the silence, not the storyteller. And now, decades later, we still do. We still whisper his name, still wonder if the story was true, still imagine the line descending into something too deep for the world to hold. But we rarely ask, who was Mel? Because we don't really want an answer. The mystery is better with him in it. I've seen, I've heard, a voice on the line describing something that shouldn't be real, but refuses to fade. He once said, "If I never speak of this again, at least someone heard it once." And we did. And now you have too. So next time you hear something late at night, a hum, a shift in the air, a quiet question with no answer, maybe you'll think of Mel, not as a name, not as a man, but as a voice, calling across the dark, just in case someone's listening. Stories bend. That's part of their charm. We stretch them to fit the shape of our wonder. We smooth the edges that don't quite match. We make room for mystery. But some stories stretch too far, so far in fact, that something begins to break. Not the story itself, but the rules beneath it. Mel's tale was always soft-spoken. It didn't demand belief, it invited it. But once you try to measure his claims, not with rope, but with reason, things begin to fray. Let's begin with the depth. Mel said he lowered a line into the hole, fishing line, mile after mile, until it reached 82,000 feet. That's over 24 kilometers deep. It sounds impressive, but there's a problem. The deepest hole ever drilled by humans is the Kola super deep borehole in Russia, a Soviet project that lasted decades. It reached 12.2 kilometers before the Earth itself pushed back. Below that depth, the pressure becomes extreme. Temperatures rise beyond what our tools can handle. Metal warps, drills melt, the rock behaves more like plastic. Even getting that far took advanced machinery, government funding, and years of effort. So how could Mel, with a pulley and fishing line, reach double that depth on the side of a quiet hill in Washington? He couldn't. Not physically, not geologically, not even theoretically. The Earth doesn't allow it. There is no known cavity, natural or artificial. The deep and that narrow. Gravity would collapse it. Heat would distort it. The pressure alone would crush anything, sending past crust. Even if a hole like that somehow existed, open to the air, you'd face other problems. Air pressure, for example. At those depths, the atmosphere inside the shaft would become dangerous. Air would thicken, oxygen would compress. Any flame dropped into it would either go out instantly or cause an explosion. Mel claimed he lowered a radio transmitter and even a flare, but a flare burning for more than a few thousand feet? Unlikely. There wouldn't be enough oxygen to sustain it. And what about the line? Standard fishing line has a tensile strength of about 10 to 30 pounds, depending on type. Let's be generous. Assume Mel used professional grade line, built for saltwater fishing. That still wouldn't explain how he supported over 80,000 feet of line and a weight without the line snapping under its own weight. Line isn't weightless. Every foot adds stress. Eventually, even the line holding the line becomes too heavy. So unless Mel had access to space-age materials, the story begins to sag. Even if we grant that the pulley could handle it, the spooling, the tension, the flawless descent, there's still the question of measurement. Mel claimed he measured the depth based on the length of line used, but line stretches, knots fail. There's no guarantee the line moved in a perfect vertical descent. It could have coiled, snagged, twisted. He would have needed to apply constant tension, monitor environmental factors, calculate drift, none of which he reported doing, but of course, he wasn't a scientist. He was just a man lowering a weight into a quiet, dark place. And maybe that's the point. Mel wasn't trying to win a debate. He wasn't claiming he had data. He had a feeling, a sense of something wrong, something large, something silent. And we don't measure that kind of thing in kilometers. We measure it in disbelief or in wonder. Still, it's hard not to notice how logic bends under the weight of his claims. He said birds wouldn't fly over the hole, but birds don't follow orders. They don't observe boundaries for long, and there's no photographic record of this aversion, no videos of birds swerving away mid-flight. He said animals refused to go near, that electronics failed, that flares vanished, but none of this was recorded. None of it was tested in controlled conditions. His word was the only evidence, and yet we listened. Why? Because his voice didn't sound like invention. It sounded like reflection, and that's a dangerous kind of storytelling. Because when a story doesn't push When it simply rests in your mind, you stop resisting. You stop asking, how could that be? And start asking, what if it were? And that's where logic falters. Not in the numbers, but in the silence. Because Mel's story didn't live in the facts. It lived in the shadows around them. It lives there still. And part of us wants to keep it alive. Because we don't like to let go of mysteries, even broken ones, especially broken ones. There's something beautiful about a story that doesn't hold up under scrutiny, but still won't let go of your thoughts. It becomes less like a report and more like a poem, a shape, a feeling, a riddle with no answer and no need for one. We don't believe it because it's true. We believe it because we want it to be true, and wanting is a kind of gravity. It pulls stories downward, past the surface of sense, into something deeper, something like a hole. So what do we do when a story we love starts to crack? Do we throw it away, call it false and move on? Or do we sit with it a while longer? Do we trace its edges not for truth, but for meaning? That's what Mel invites us to do. To stand at the edge of the impossible, knowing it can't be, but feeling something anyway. A kind of sadness, a kind of thrill, a kind of quiet hunger for a world that isn't quite this one. And even now, knowing what we know, you might still feel it. The part of you that doesn't care about tensile strength, or air pressure, or geology. The part of you that just wants to believe in a whole that never ends. Every story shifts when told more than once. Mel's story was no exception. Between his first call in 1997 and his later appearances on the radio, things changed. Not drastically, not immediately, but enough to feel it. At first, he was just a man with a hole, a quiet voice describing an impossible depth, animals avoiding a place, and fishing line that never found bottom. But in later calls, something crept in. Strangeness, surreal details, hints of something bigger than a hole in the ground. Mel began to talk about interference, phones going dead, unmarked helicopters hovering over his land, government officials who showed up without explanation, men in black clothes. He said he had been forced to leave his property, that he was relocated, that he was, briefly, sent to Australia, of all places, without explanation, no dates, no names, just the statement. Listeners began to divide. Some felt he was losing credibility. Others thought he was being silenced. Then came the second hole. In a later call, Mel claimed he had found another pit. This one, not in Washington, but in Nevada. It was located on land leased by Native Americans. He described it as similar in shape, but with stranger qualities. According to Mel, objects placed near the Nevada hole experienced bizarre effects, time distortion, biological anomalies. He told the story of a sheep lowered into the hole, which returned, changed. Inside it, he said, was something like a tumor, but not organic, not animal, something mechanical. He didn't offer pictures or names, just the tale. It sounded like science fiction, because it was, and yet, he didn't tell it that way. He told it in the same soft, measured tone, the same calm rhythm that had made his first story so strangely believable. And that's what made it worse, or better, depending on how you feel about doubt. Because by then, Mel's story wasn't just a story, it was a growing legend. It had spread through late-night forums, message boards, cassette tapes, traded among truckers and insomniacs. People wanted to believe, and when belief is in motion, facts can become flexible. Some listeners called in claiming they had seen the hole. Others said they lived nearby. A few said they had worked with Mel. None could prove it, but the hole didn't need proof anymore. It had become a place of suggestion. The more impossible the story became, the more people leaned into it. Why? Because we don't follow stories for their accuracy. We followed them for their Mel's tale was no longer about geology. It was about fear, about wonder, about secrecy, about the thrill of something being just out of reach. Inconsistency didn't destroy it. It fed it. Each time the details broke apart, a new layer formed, more strange, more shadowed, more unprovable. It stopped being a report. It became a ritual. Something passed between voices in the dark. Mel was no longer just Mel. He was the man who knew something, even if we didn't know what it was. Even if he didn't. That's the power of myth. It adapts, it shifts, it survives the collapse of its own logic. When a story falls apart, we don't always abandon it. Sometimes we enter it, we explore the cracks, we imagine the missing parts, we give it new breath. And that's what happened here. People started creating their own editions, drawings, speculative maps, dream journals referencing bottomless voids, YouTube videos years later whispering, "What if Mel was telling the truth?" Others began looking for the hole, driving through the hills of Washington, hoping to feel something, even just a wrongness in the air, but none found it. Or if they did, they didn't come back to say so. The story became self-contained, a loop. You couldn't prove it, but you couldn't quite dismiss it either. It lived where a lot of good stories live, between memory and imagination. Mel's contradictions weren't a flaw. They were part of the design, like a dream that changes mid-scene, a forest that rearranges itself each time you walk through it. And what's most fascinating is that Mel himself didn't seem bothered by the shifts. He never corrected his own inconsistencies, never apologized, never clarified. He spoke like someone following the story at the same time we were, as if he didn't know where it was going either, as if he was just trying to keep up. And that made it feel even more real. Because real people don't tell stories perfectly. They wander, they forget, they contradict themselves. Mel never claimed to be precise. He claimed to be honest. And in a strange way, that honesty felt more powerful than accuracy. You can fake data, you can forge evidence, but you can't fake the quiet way someone tells you, "I don't know what it is, I just know what I saw." And that's the core of the mystery. Not the depth, not the science, not the holes, but the man who didn't try to convince us, who just told the story again, and again, and again, each time a little different, each time a little deeper. So what do we do with that? Do we dismiss it? Say, "It doesn't make sense, so it must be false"? Or do we accept that mystery often wears different faces? That maybe what breaks the logic also opens the myth? That maybe the lie, if it is a lie, still tells a kind of truth. The truth about how stories move, how belief forms, how silence pulls us in. And maybe that's the real center of the whole. Not a physical space, not a bottomless shaft, but a place inside us where wonder overrides reason, where we stop asking, "Is this real?" and start asking, "What if it was?" There's nothing new about a hole in the ground. Long before Mel Waters spoke on the radio, long before radio even existed, we were already dreaming about openings into the earth, dark mouths that swallowed light, gates to places beneath us, silences that echoed not with sound, but with meaning. every ancient culture the earth had an underside, a place of spirits, of endings, of beginnings, and often that place could be reached through a hole. The Greeks had Hades, not just a god, but a realm beneath all things. There were entrances to that realm, caves, fissures, places where the air turned cold for no reason. Plato, in The Republic, wrote of the myth of error. A soldier dies on the battlefield, only to return days later, claiming he saw souls descending through a great chasm and rising again through another. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't heaven or hell. It was a system, a cycle, and at the center of it, a hole. In Siberia, nomadic tribes told stories of places where the ground itself would open and consume whatever crossed it. Livestock, hunters, whole caravans. Later, science would label these as gas craters, the result of methane and permafrost. But to those who lived there, they were mouths, warnings, living proof that the land could speak. In Mesoamerica, the Mayans treated cenotes, deep natural sinkholes, as sacred. They were entrances to the underworld known as Xibalba. Ceremonies were held at their edges, offerings made, even sacrifices performed, not in cruelty, but in reverence. Because the hole wasn't just a gap in the earth, it was a path to ancestors, to gods, to something beyond understanding. In Norse mythology, there was Yggdrasil, the world tree. At its roots lay deep wells, Mimisbrunner, the well of wisdom, and Urdarbrunner, the well of fate. Odin himself gave his eye to drink from those depths, to know something forbidden, to see what others could not. Even for a god, knowledge came from descending. You start to see a pattern. These holes, these dark vertical places, were never just emptiness. They were boundaries, places where our world brushes against another. They marked the line between the known and the unknowable, between what we are and what we fear we might be. So when Mel spoke of a hole that swallowed light, that accepted anything without echo, he wasn't inventing something new. He was remembering something old, something already written in the bones of our myths. He gave it a modern skin, fishing line, radio waves, government agents, but the shape was ancient, a vertical descent, a silence that listens, a warning that doesn't shout, but waits. The hole is a symbol. It always has been, of death, of transformation, of madness sometimes, but also of truth. Because the only way to know what's inside is to go down, to surrender height, to leave behind the light, become smaller and smaller and smaller until the descent becomes the only thing left. In dreams, we fall, not up, not sideways, always down into oceans, into darkness, into rooms that weren't there before. The subconscious doesn't float, it sinks, and that's what the hole represents too. A door that opens downward into the self, into the parts of us that memory forgot. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the forgotten self, the sealed place inside the psyche where we store the things we don't want to face. And it waits, not to trap us, but to be acknowledged. Every culture has its version of this, a journey into darkness, into mystery, into the hidden, and always a return, if you're lucky. So perhaps Mel's hole wasn't a place, but an echo, a shape the human mind has always known, even if we forget the stories. Perhaps that's why it felt familiar the moment he spoke of it, why we didn't need pictures or proof, just the idea, a hole that shouldn't be there, but somehow is. In ancient times, some holes were filled with stones. Others were guarded, others left alone, marked only by silence. They weren't to be entered lightly, they weren't to be owned. They were reminders that not all ground is stable, that not all silence is empty, that not everything is meant for us. And in that sense, Mel's story fits perfectly. It is the modern myth of an ancient shape, an unmapped sacred site, an accidental oracle. A man finds a hole, tries to measure it, fails, tells the story, vanishes, and the hole remains, just like always. So tonight, as you close your eyes, if you picture the circle, the edge of dark earth where the world bends inward, know that you're not alone. Others have seen it, called it by other names, feared it, worshipped it, thrown things into it hoping for answers, and still it waits, not to be filled, but to be remembered. A voice can disappear just like a stone in water. It makes ripples, it disturbs the surface, and then it's gone. That's what happened to Mel Waters. For a time he was everywhere, not in person, but in echo. The man with the impossible story, the voice that described a bottomless hole without ever needing to raise it. But then, something shifted, and he vanished. Mel's last public appearance came without ceremony. One final call to Coast AM. Same voice, same quiet manner. But something had changed. He sounded tired, scattered, less certain. He spoke about government pressure, said he was no longer allowed near the hole, said he'd been taken, relocated to Australia for reasons never fully explained. He claimed he was watched, that he no longer felt safe speaking. And then he stopped speaking altogether. No more calls, no new interviews, no public trace. Mel Waters disappeared, and no one knows what happened next. There were theories, of course, that he was silenced, that he was institutionalized, that he died, that he never existed in the first place. But none of these theories felt satisfying, because Mel had never asked to be believed, and that perhaps what made his disappearance feel so heavy. He simply stopped, and in doing so, he became more powerful than ever. In most stories, disappearance is an ending, but in this story, it was an expansion. The absence of Mel became a kind of presence, a hollow space where meaning grew. He became like the hole itself, unreachable, silent, dark, and somehow more convincing than if he'd stayed. We don't know where he lived, or where he went, or if Mel Waters was his real name. There are no confirmed photos, no published addresses, only fragments. A few callers claimed they knew him. One said they saw him in Nevada. Another insisted he had been buried in Washington under a different name, but none of it was provable. It's easy to think of that silence as defeat, that he ran out of story, that he gave up. But what if the silence wasn't an accident? What if it was part of the message? Because sometimes the most lasting myths aren't built by presence, but by withdrawal. The ones who vanish become more permanent than the ones who stay. They harden into symbols, they stop aging, they stop arguing, they become pure. Mel's vanishing fit the shape of his story. He told us about something deep and silent, and then he became it. He disappeared into his own narrative, and now we don't remember him as a man. We remember him as an echo, a murmur, a voice on a late night line, telling us something that should not be true. And that's the beauty of it, because there is power in the storyteller who walks away, who doesn't defend himself, who doesn't clarify. We are used to noise, to explanation, to endless commentary. But but Mel left us with nothing but questions. No answers, no resolution, only a presence shaped like absence. And we filled that space with imagination. We began to wonder who else knew, what else was hidden, what the hole really was. Was it a military site, a natural anomaly, a portal? The fewer facts we had, the more theories we could hold. And so the silence became fertile. It grew. In many traditions, the teacher disappears when the lesson is done. The shaman leaves the village. The prophet ascends. The guide slips into the forest. Mel followed that pattern. He said his part, and then nothing. But maybe that nothing was the most important part, because we don't just fear the unknown, we need it. We look into dark spaces and project our own shadows. We listen to silence and hear what we're ready to hear. Mel gave us a container, a vessel, a void, and then he stepped back. Now, he's not a man anymore. He's part of the structure. You can't separate him from the whole. They are one shape. When you say Mel's whole, you're not talking about geology. You're talking about story, about how something invisible can still leave a mark. If Mel had stayed, kept calling, kept explaining, maybe the story would have faded, but silence preserved him, like the air at the bottom of a cave, unchanged by light. He became part of the mystery by stepping out of it, and now we carry him in the way we speak about the whole, in the way we listen for echoes, in the way we trust quiet things more than loud ones. It's tempting to say he was silenced, that someone, somewhere, made him stop. But maybe, just maybe, he chose the quiet. Maybe he looked into the hole one last time and realized he had nothing left to say. And maybe that was exactly enough. Next time you think about this story, the fishing line, the birds, the deep black nothing, don't forget the man who whispered it into being, the one who left without asking for anything, not belief, not money, not fame, just your attention. And when that was given, he left, like a ripple, like a shadow, like a voice you can still hear when the radio is off. Some stories don't end, not because they go on forever, but because they were never meant to be closed. They're not puzzles, they're not problems, they're shapes, dreams, open hands, and Mel's hole was one of them. Maybe you've noticed by now, this was never about geology, or fishing line, or government agents. It was about something quieter, a whisper you almost hear, a shape your mind returns to when everything else falls away. It was about mystery, the kind you don't solve, the kind you keep, because we are full of holes in our memories, in our explanations, in the way we try to understand the world. We patch what we can, ignore what we can't, and once in a while, we name the emptiness. We call it a story. We call it Mel. We call it a hole that shouldn't be there. And suddenly it feels more manageable, but it never was. If you've stayed this far, then the story now belongs to you. You've heard the details, the strange, the impossible, the broken. You've stood at the edge, listened to the wind, waited for the rope to go taut, and still, nothing, only silence, and that silence is yours now. Mel is gone. The hole is not on any map, no photos, no location, no coordinates, but somehow you remember exactly what it looks like. Dark, still, endless. You've never been there, and yet you've stood beside it, because the hole isn't in Washington. It's in the part of you that needs some things to remain unsolved. Think of every story that stayed with you, the ones that didn't explain themselves, the ones that didn't end neatly, the ones that left something out on purpose. This story is like that. It doesn't need belief. It doesn't need truth. It only needs space, a little quiet, and someone to listen. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe you'll forget Mel Waters. Maybe you'll forget this recording. Maybe tomorrow it will feel like a dream. But maybe not. Maybe a year from now, you'll be walking in the woods, and the air will feel different, a little heavier, a little older, and you'll remember that there's a place, a shape, a silence that doesn't belong, and somehow that makes it feel even more real. Some say the whole never existed. Some say Mel made it all up. But stories don't have to be real to change us. They just have to find the right shape, the right moment, the right silence, and then we carry them like a tune we hum without remembering where we heard it. So if you're wondering what the whole really was, you're not alone. Maybe it was a metaphor. Maybe it was a real shaft in the earth. Maybe it was a voice, just looking for someone to hear it. Or maybe it was you, the part of you that listens, that watches, that dreams. Tonight, you can close your eyes, let go of the rope, stop waiting for the weight to hit bottom. Let it fall, forever, if it wants to. The hole doesn't need an end, only an opening, and you've opened it. Now, whenever you want, you can return to the edge, to the dark, to the silence that asked nothing from you except to listen. Because not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be shared, like a dream, like a lullaby, like a voice at the bottom of a hole that shouldn't be there.